Hi everyone, thank you for coming. My name is Courtney Forehand. I'm the Training and Marketing Specialist for the Colorado Municipal League. And we, on behalf of everyone here, we want to thank you for attending today's webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our website by the end of this week. For those of you who are not familiar with the webinar format, you should see a control panel in the top right of your screen. You have an orange arrow to the left of the panel, which will minimize the entire box. All participants will be muted for the webinar, but we encourage you to ask questions by typing them into the question box on the control panel. We will hold a question and answer near the end of the webinar, but please feel free to type the questions as you think of them throughout the presentation. And that question box also will be monitored throughout. CMCA is offering half a credit per this webinar towards the CMC or MMC designation for member clerks who are attending. To obtain this credit, you will need to complete the assessment found at the CML website and submit it to cmcaclerks@gmail.com. Our presenter today is Karen Goldman. Karen is the former Deputy City Clerk of Aurora and has been offering insight and guidance to clerks across Colorado for the past several years through the Municipal Clerk Advisor Program, sponsored by CML, CIRSA, and CMCA. Karen is very active on our clerks listserv, and she is the primary author of the election book, hot off the presses and recently mailed to clerks in all CML member municipalities. We're so grateful to have Karen here with us today, and at this time, I'll turn things over to her.
Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar. I'm very excited to be able to participate with all of you again this year. This is part one of a series of 5 election webinars, and each webinar will be about an hour long, and the idea is to provide you with information prior to you actually needing it for your April 2020 elections. And while this is geared towards the statutory town elections that are held in April of even-numbered years, anybody and everybody can participate. Before I get started, I want to talk a little bit about an expectation that I have. We're going to talk today about how you build your town election calendar. And my strong suggestion is that you build your calendar, you create your calendar first. Doing, in my opinion, is one of the best ways of learning. And while clerks are fabulous at responding to requests for information and for forms, and I really appreciate everybody's participation in that respect, I believe that if you go out on the listserv or on the CMCA website and ask for a copy of a calendar and just accept it wholesale, you're not getting an opportunity to do some very important learning. So create it first. We're going to provide you with a lot of tools to be able to do that here today. And then if you want to shop it around and compare it with somebody else, that's fine. But there really is no substitute for doing it yourself. The other thing I'd like to say is that there is no substitute for actually reading the election statutes. The Municipal Election Code of 1965, Title 31, Article 10 is very, very important to read. The election book that you've received, and I sort of complain, not really, but I sort of complain that no one's asked me for my autograph yet, but that's okay. The election book is there to supplement the statutes and not to replace it. So having said all that, let's get started. Let's see. All right.
You should have control.
Okay. No? We're waiting to, there we go. Okay. All right. So, pre-election calendar creation procedures. What you want to do is you want to make sure you have calendar pages available for the months of January through April of 2020 and maybe even into May. As I previously said, it's important to review and become familiar with Title 31, Article 10, which is the Colorado Municipal Election Code of 1965. Quite honestly, everything you need to know can be found in state statute. I'm also suggesting that you review other materials. You've got the new 2019 election book. I think if you're looking at putting something, a Tabor matter on your ballot in April, I think it's also important to consult the Colorado Constitution and that portion of the Title I, which is the Uniform Election Code of 1992 for information regarding Tabor. And then I think it's also important to contact your county clerk and remind your county clerk that you have your election in April of next year. And these are at least some things you want to make sure that the county clerk is aware that they need to work with you on. You want to find out, first of all, whether you have any UOCAVA covered voters residing within your municipality. And UOCAVA covered voters are voters who get their ballots 45 days before the day of your election. They are primarily military people. They are also folks who may be who are registered to vote within your municipality, but may not be residing within the country or within the state on the day of the election. You also want to remind the county clerk that one of the things that they are obligated to do is to provide you with voter registration lists at certain times throughout the election process. And then the other thing is to be able to see if somebody from your county clerk's office would be available on your election day to answer questions throughout the entire time the polls are open, which would be 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Now, having said that, I want to remind people that in 2020, the county clerks will be running their first presidential primary election in many, many years. And so next year, in addition to the regular congressional primary and the general election, they've got a third election. And so their cooperation may be limited. However, I do think it's important to ask the question. Okay, so now let's talk about dates. This is pretty important because the dates are your legal requirements. And here's what you do. When you're counting backwards from election day, and when I say backwards, I mean the days prior to the date of your election, you begin with the day before your election. The best way, in my opinion, to think about it is to identify election day as day 0. Then the day before the election, that Monday, is day 1. Then the Sunday before that Monday is day 2. And you count all the way back until you get at least 91 days prior to the day of the election. Likewise, when you're counting forward from election day, you begin with the day after the election. And again, once again, election day is day 0. So the Wednesday after your election is day 1, the Thursday, day 2, and so on and so forth. So that's pretty important. And I am fairly old-fashioned. I like to have paper pages, calendar pages, and put those dates down. And once you have the dates down, as you see when we get into the requirements of what to do on specific dates, it will be very, very easy to determine what the date is. One thing I want to also remind you of is 2020 is a leap year. That means there is an extra day in February. There will be a February 29th. It is a calendar day, and it needs to be included in your calculations. And one other caution, we know there are 31 days in January. We know now there are 29 days in February, 31 days in March, and so on. I don't like to add the days together and then figure out how many days. I like to actually count the days, and my suggestion to you is that you do that as well. The other thing you want to do, and this is pretty important, is to pay attention to the following phrases because they can be different. For example, if it says prior to the 63rd day before the election, prior to 63 days before the election, that means your deadline is 64 days because 64 is prior to 63. If it says no later than 63 days before the election, then your deadline is the 63rd day. Likewise, if it says not earlier than the 63rd day, the first day you do it is the 63rd day. And then the word before, I think, is fairly self-explanatory. Really pay attention to these words, because one day's difference can mean the difference between your election being legal and not legal. Okay, again, on determining the dates, you're going to count all calendar days, including weekends and holidays. Okay, every day, including the 29th of February as well. So there are a couple of exceptions to this, and here's how you deal with weekend and holidays. In general, anything that has to do with the nomination petition process, that would be amending the petitions, withdrawing from nomination once a petition has been filed and certified, filing notices of intent to be a write-in candidate. If any of those or any other things that deal with the nomination petition process fall on a weekend or holiday, and I guarantee you something will, the last day to effect the procedure is the preceding Friday. So let me say that again. The last day to effect the procedure dealing with nomination petitions in our nominations in general is the preceding Friday. However, if any other procedure falls on a weekend or a holiday, the last day is extended to the very next day following the weekend or the holiday. So need to also pay attention to those exceptions. Okay. Now we're going to go through the election dates. And what I've noted here is that whether you have a polling place or a mail ballot election, a lot of the procedures have the same deadlines in both. There will be some things that are specific to polling place election, and in that case I've noted PP behind the date, or if it's only specific to a mail ballot election, I've noted MB behind there. So, all right, 91 days before the day of the election is the first day to circulate nomination petitions. 91 days before the day of the election. And that is true for both mail ballot and polling place elections. And that was a change we made several years ago. I don't think it's new. I think everybody understands that. Okay. 90 days before the day of the election is the first day to receive a written request for an absentee ballot. Now, I will tell you that absentee ballots are more likely to be used in polling place elections than they are mail ballot elections, because in a polling place election, the only choice is to go to the polls on election day, where in a mail ballot election, ballots are mailed out within a certain time period, 22 to 15 days before the day of the election, and so people don't have to be present and on election day in order to vote. Please remember that mail ballots are not forwarded by the Postal Service. So if anybody is intending to be out of the municipality for a long period of time prior to the April election, they probably want to apply for an absentee ballot. And then 71 days before the day of the election is the last day to circulate and file the nomination petitions. 71 days before the day of the election usually falls midweek. I know there are some municipalities that are closed on Friday or are only open partial days on Friday, but the deadline for filing those petitions should not be affected by that. If for some reason you are going to be closed on that particular day, you have a couple of choices, in my opinion. One is that you can, I know it's not a great choice, but you can come in and be available anyway, or you can make sure that everybody knows that they can file their petition the day before. But 91 and 71 are the 2 days you need, the dates you need for nomination petitions. All right. 65 days before the election is the last day to file a notice of intent to be a write-in candidate. And if you actually look at statute, it talks about, this is one of those situations where it says, if no later than 64 prior, if by the 64th day, prior to the 64th day is when the deadline for the write-in candidate. So we've listed it here as 65 days. 64 days before the election, it's the last day to amend a nomination petition. As you all know, when the petitions come in, they have to be filed with at least the minimum number of required signatures to be sufficient, which in statutory towns is 10. So they have to turn in 10. It doesn't mean that once you check the signatures, all 10 will be valid. And we talk about doing this in the next webinar we're holding in December. So they have the ability to amend, and they have to do it no later than 64 days before the day of the election. It's also the last day to withdraw from nomination. If somebody files a nomination petition and then wakes up one morning thinking, oh my goodness, what was I thinking, and decides to withdraw, they should do it in writing, and they have until the 64th day before the election in order to do that. And then the 64th day before the election is the deadline whereby if there are not more candidates than offices to be filled, and that includes write-in candidates, which we get into later, and voting on candidates is the only thing that you're going to be voting on in April, and you have an ordinance that allows you to cancel an election, that's the date you can cancel the election. It doesn't mean you formally cancel it, but that's the deadline by which you know whether an election can be canceled. The cancellation process, which again we go in more detail in a future webinar, is done by resolution of the governing body. Okay, 60 days before the day of the election is when your county clerk provides you with a list of your UOCAVA covered registered electors. What I would suggest you do is just ask them simply for that list. Now, several things are going to happen with that list, and I think it's important to mention here. Sometimes the address is going to be a local address. Sometimes and in which case you just send it to whatever address they give you. But sometimes the address is going to be an email address, because the county clerks, by law, are able to send out UOCAVA covered ballots via email to the designated voters. Under Title 31, we do not have that option. The only way that UOCAVA ballots can be sent and received is by mail. So when you get an email address, this is my suggestion. You contact the person via email. You let that person know that there's going to be a municipal election held on a particular date, and you tell them that according to law, the only way they can receive a ballot is by mail. So if they want to vote in that election, they need to send you an address to which that ballot can be mailed. And then you just wait and see what happens. This way you give people an opportunity to self-select as to whether they wish to vote in a local election. And you don't disenfranchise somebody just because you don't have a postal address. Okay, now we have 46 days before the day of the election. That is the last day to file comments with the municipal clerk for any TABOR issue. A TABOR issue, as you know, is something that deals with money. It could be a tax increase, a tax policy change. It could be the incursion of debt, but that's exactly what it is. And they can file comments with you prior to 46 days before the day of the election. There's been some question, do you have to solicit for comments? The answer is by law, no, you do not have to solicit. Some municipalities do. Just remember that if you do solicit for comments in one TABOR election, you're pretty much set a precedent and will have to do it for subsequent elections. There are pros and cons, no pun intended, but there are pros and cons for either way of handling it. And then 45 days before the day of the election is the last day to mail your ballot and your ballot materials to UOCAVA covered voters. And all of this information can be found in how to do it and what to include in Title 31. Now, if you have something going on the ballot by the citizen process, either a citizen initiative or a referendum that has to do with tax or financial matters, the way the law reads is that based on comments that you've received, the municipal clerk is responsible for creating a summary both in favor and in opposition of the item that's going on the ballot, except when the item gets to the ballot via the citizen process. If it does get to the ballot that way, then it is up to the petitioners to provide you with a summary that is included in the ballot issue notice, and they have to do that 43 days before the day of the election, and they have to do it based on comments that you received. So if there is a citizen initiative and you have not received any comments at all, then there is nothing for them to write because all summaries are based on comments received. And then we move on to 30 days before the day of the election, and that's the last day to mail the ballot issue notice to each household having at least one registered voter. And you don't send the ballot issue notice to every registered elector. You just send it to each household at which one registered elector resides. So if there's one person at an address or there are 4 people at an address, each address receives one notice, and it's a cost savings measure. Now, I want to point out the fact that you're going to be mailing your ballots to your UOCAVA covered voters prior to mailing the ballot issue notice. And that's just the way it is. And basically, what you find here is you find one year a law is passed and everything works out. And then subsequent years, another law is passed that makes the previous law that was passed an issue. Just do what the law says. Okay. 30 days before the day of the election is also the last day for the county clerk to provide you with a list of registered electors in a mail ballot election, because those ballots have to go out 22 days before the day of the election. All right. I know we're going through this quickly, but we are going through it. 22 days before the day of the election is, if you're doing a mail ballot election, that is the first day to send out the mail ballots. And it is also the first day where those ballots must be available in your office. And the reason you have them available in your office is for people who never got a ballot, and the reason they wouldn't get a ballot is because they were not registered to vote and were not on the voter registration list that the county gave you 30 days before, because as you know, that people can register to vote up to and including Election Day in Colorado, as long as they have been a resident in the state 22 days prior to the day of the election and a resident of the municipality on the day that they register to vote. So you may get some people who didn't get a ballot because they weren't on the original voter registration list. They also might come into your office because they spoiled their ballot. Their dog ate their ballot, or they made a mistake or something like that, and they want to have a replacement ballot. So you have to have those ballots available in your office during regular and normal business hours on the same day you mail them out. And I guarantee you that in some places, those ballots are going to come back as soon as people receive them. Okay. 21 days before the day of the election. This deals with reports of contributions and expenditures in accordance with the Fair Campaign Practices Act. And in the Fair Campaign Practices Act for municipal elections, there are 3 election filing dates and 1 annual filing date. So the first day to file is 21 days prior to the day of the election. And quite honestly, this date is the same whether it's a regular election or a special municipal election. So that's the date the first report is due, and it is due at the end of the business day, whatever that is, whether it's 4:30 or 5 o'clock or whatever you close your offices. Then 20 days before the day of the election, there is a requirement in Title I, and this is one of those situations where you have to refer to Title I, and I've given you the citation, that if you have a ballot issue concerning a debt or other financial obligation, then you have to post an additional notice in your office and also probably at the location where you do your normal postings. And this statute will tell you exactly what has to be included in that particular notice. I didn't list it here, but you've got the citation and you can go ahead and do it then. And then 20 days before the day of the election is the last day for the county clerk to provide a supplemental list of registered electors. And the names that would appear on the supplemental list would be those people who were not on the original list, but who had registered prior to 22 days before the day of the election. And my suggestion would be that when you ask the county for this list, and remember at the very beginning, I told you to contact the county and let them know about the list they have to provide. And it would be very important when you do contact the county clerks to say, I need a registration list on 30 days before, which is this date, then I need another list on this date, and you'll see in the mail ballot, there are actually 3 lists that you need. But when asking for this particular list, just ask the county clerk for any additions that did not appear on the first list they gave you. And that will make it easier for them to pull that information up, and it'll make it a lot easier for you to go ahead and send ballots to those people without having to wade through your list of all your registered electors. Okay, 15 days before the day of the election, by law, it is the last day to appoint your election judges. And you need at least 3 election judges in order to operate your election. Let me talk about this 15 days. You'll notice also that 15 days before the day of the election is the last day to send out mail ballots, and it's also the first day to count mail ballots. And I'm going to talk about what count means in just a moment, but let's talk about the election judges. It's the last day to appoint election judges. It doesn't mean it's the only day to appoint election judges. And if you are doing a mail ballot election and you happen to work in a municipality that has a substantial number of registered electors, and you anticipate that you're going to have a lot of ballots being returned, and we all know that we don't get 100% of the ballots returned that we send out. But if you think it's going to be substantial, you can start processing ballots that 15 days, which means you're going to want to have your judges in place and appointed well before that last day, that 15 days before the day of the election. Now, in a polling place election, it's not really an issue, but in a mail ballot election, it would be a good idea to have them appointed prior to the 15 days. And remember, in a mail ballot election where you're doing signature verification, you need to train these folks in order to do it. So it's probably a good idea to have them available in a mail ballot election prior to that 15 days. So moving on, let's talk about the first day to count mail ballot elections. And this came up in a question recently on the listserv. What does count mean? Even though the language in statute says it's the first day to count mail ballots, this is the way I view it. This is my interpretation based on experience. There are several processes that you do prior to actually tabulating the vote. You receive a mail ballot, you check the signature, you open the ballot envelope, you take the voted ballot, you stick it in a ballot box along with a whole bunch of others, so you've separated, you have no idea which ballot belonged to which envelope, thereby not knowing who voted which ballot. And you do all of that, and all of that can be done prior to actually counting or tabulating the vote. Now, if you look at statute regarding tabulating the vote, It refers you to another statute for tabulating paper ballots and tabulating ballots that have been voted on machines, which are the two primary ways that people in statutory towns count their ballots. So in a paper ballot election where you're counting paper ballots, it is very clear in statute that you don't start doing that until the polls have closed at 7 o'clock. So that means that by counting the ballots, you are doing everything prior to 7 o'clock on election night except actually tabulating. The same holds true for people who are using using voting equipment in order where you can press a button and you get the election results. You're not going to do that until after the polls close at 7 o'clock. And people, as you know, if people are in line waiting to vote at 7 o'clock, they're still eligible to vote. So you wait until all that's done before you actually count or tabulate the ballots. So I wanted to make sure that that was very clear. Moving on. We're almost there. We're almost to Election Day. 10 days before the day of the election is the last day to publish and post notice of the election. And as I think all of you know, or if you don't know, a bill passed this last legislative session talked about changing your, well, actually you have to designate your posting location. At the beginning of every year, you're posting your notice of the election at your designated areas. And so you would do that 10 days before the election, and you would publish it in your local newspaper. If your newspaper is a weekly newspaper, not a daily newspaper, then what you do is you publish it. You have election week, you have the week before, and then you have 2 weeks before. And so it would go in the weekly publication 2 weeks before the day of the election, which would meet the 10-day notice requirement. And then for polling place elections, that's the last day to post your notice at polling locations. And then for polling place elections, it's also the last day for you to have your regular and your sample ballots in your possession. You hold them, and so if people come in and they want to know, well, what are we voting on? You can give them a sample ballot, but that has to be done 10 days before. Okay, 5 days before the day of the election in a polling place election, it's another list of registered electors provided by the county clerk. 4 days before the day of the election, which is the Friday before the day of the election, is the last day to apply in writing for an absentee ballot. And I should mention that if somebody emails or calls and says, I want an absentee ballot, what they're really asking, they don't know it. And what you need to know is what you would do at that point is you would send them a ballot application form, which they must complete in writing. You must have a written record of everybody who has applied for an absentee ballot. And there's information on it that is in addition to people going, well, hey, I'm not going to be in town, I need an absentee ballot. So they can apply for an absentee ballot application by email, over the phone, but the actual application has to be completed in writing and filed with you. And that has to be done by the end of business on the day before the election. The Friday before the day of the election. The Friday before the day of the election is also the deadline for filing what's the second report of contribution and expenditures. And that, again, has to be filed by the end of business. And then 1 day before the day of the election, in a polling place election, one of your election judges needs to come in and receive the ballot and the voter registration list, and that has to be maintained in their presence overnight and until the election day. And you need to have them sign a receipt for that. In other words, the day before the election, the ballots are out of your hands and out of your control. So now Election Day. The polls are open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And that is true whether you're having a polling place or a mail ballot election. Now, obviously, in a polling place election, people are going to be coming in and voting at your polling location. So it's pretty clear that you have to have the polls open and available from that time. In a mail ballot election, the reason you keep it open is that somebody can drop off in person their mail ballot at 7 o'clock in the morning before they go to work. So you have to be open. It does not mean you have to bring your election judges in at 7 a.m. and have them, sit all day and maybe not do anything until later in the day. And again, we'll talk about that later on. We do cover that when we talk about election judges. But whether you're doing a mail ballot election or a polling place election, you have your polling location. And if your office is your drop-off location in a mail ballot election, consider that your polling location. And they have to be open, again, as I said, from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Ballots received after 7 o'clock cannot be counted. Now, this is what I always suggest. Make sure you talk to your postal service and let them know you're having an election. The ballots in a mail ballot election, and even for absentee ballots, the ballots are very clearly marked on the front, or should be, that they are election materials, and that should alert the post office folks that they are election materials. For those of you in the metro area who are election nerds like I am and who've been following all the hoopla from this last election, know there was an issue with the post office and the Secretary of State, and I'm not going to get into it, but you know that for whatever reason, the post office was alleged to have missed the fact that there were ballots that needed to be delivered. So you want to talk to your post office, and the thing that I would suggest is make arrangements with the post office for how you will obtain any ballots that get turned into the post office but not delivered to you. In other words, they get turned into the post office after the post office delivers the mail to you, and how you can get those ballots so that people who were delayed or procrastinated or for whatever reason waited till the very last moment to vote, that those ballots can also be in your possession by 7 o'clock so they can be counted. Postmarks for anything other than UOCAVA covered voters do not matter. They have to be in your hands by 7 o'clock. But the UOCAVA covered ballots have to be postmarked via postal mail in order to be counted. Now, quite honestly, I don't know how they do it in France. I don't know how they do it in Iraq. I don't know how they do it, but the way the law reads is that they have to be postmarked on election day. They get to be received, and this is the next point, they can be received up to 8 days or no later than 8 days after the election in order to be counted. So they're sent out early to account for a long trek to wherever they are, and they're allowed to come back later to account for the same. In a mail ballot election, and when you're doing signature verification and you and your election judges cannot adequately determine that the signature on the back of the return envelope matches the signature in the voter registration database, then a letter is sent to those voters asking them to fill out a form that indicates that, yes, they voted in the election and they include an ID. And if you get all that information back no later than 8 days before the day of the election, then those ballots can be counted. All right. 10 days after the day of the election is the last day to conduct the canvass. And the canvass is conducted with the mayor, a municipal judge, or if neither of those are available, or if the mayor was on the ballot, a person eligible to serve as election judge but who didn't serve in the election. And the canvass, which we talk about all this stuff later on, the canvass is not a redo, it's just a review of what was done. And remember, on election night, after those ballots have been counted, those results are unofficial. They only become official at the time of the canvass. And the canvass is held 10 days after to allow for UOCAVA covered voters and the discrepant signature letters to be returned so that those ballots can be included toward the total. It is also the last day for an interested party to request a recount at his or her expense. The interested party could be a losing candidate. An interested party could be petitioners on an item that got put on the ballot as a result of the citizen initiative and referendum process. And then if you have a recount, you have 15 days until after the day of the election to complete a mandatory or optional recount. An optional recount is one that's requested by an interested party. The mandatory recount is one that occurs as a result of the results being close enough to meet the requirements in statute. 17 days after the election, it's the last day for somebody who can contest the results of the election, and you have the ability to do that. There is a provision in statute that talks about the contest. And then 30 days after the election is a third and final report of contributions and expenditures. And they're due again at the close of your business day. All right. Here's some other things. 46 days after the election, you can destroy signature cards if there's been no challenge. And this is in a polling place election and again in a polling place and election. 6 months and 1 day after the election, ballots and absentee ballot materials can be destroyed, and they include the voter ID envelopes, ballot stubs, rejected ballots, etc. And then in April of the subsequent year, if you have people who have established committees, either candidate or issue committees, and they have filed their campaign finance reports at the timeframes as required by statute, and at the end of that 30-day time period, they still have an open committee, which means they have money left over in their campaign accounts. They are obligated to file an annual report, and that report is due on the first of the month, and the month is the month in which the election took place. So it would be April 1st of 2021. People likely to have money left over in their account are going to probably be candidates. Issue committees, usually once the issue has been resolved one way or the other, the issue committees disband, release the funds, and that's it. Okay. And then 2 years and 1 day after the election is the first day to destroy nomination petitions. Sometimes when you have 4-year terms, people like to know, citizens like to know who signed petitions for a candidate who may be running for re-election in the prior election cycle, which means you would want to keep those petitions longer than this 2 years and 1 day. And if you decide to do this, it needs to be included as part of your records retention schedule. Okay, in the few minutes I have left, I want to talk about other election calendars. All the information that we've provided so far and that we've talked about so far is your office election calendar. This is your calendar that identifies what you need to be paying attention to. But I also suggest that a calendar for candidates and issue committees be available to them, probably as part of their, for the candidates as part of their nomination petition packet. And believe me, they don't have to know everything that you are doing. They just need to know the things that affect them. And so I've listed things that I believe are important for candidates, prospective candidates to know. The dates for circulating the nomination petitions, the dates for amending the nomination petitions, the date for filing the Fair Campaign Practices, campaign expenditure and contribution reports, the date to withdraw, the date the swearing in will take place, and remember, I always recommend that the swearing in not take place until the results are official. The canvass has been done, which would be 10 days after the day of the election. I know some people have board meetings the day after the election and they want to get these people sworn in. I strongly recommend that you wait and you hold off and you not do it until after the canvass has been completed. So also you can, the next couple or the next few You can decide if you really want to include it, but it would be the date for requesting a mandatory recount, the date that would be held, the date to make a legal contest. And the reason that you need to think about it is sometimes by putting in those dates, you actually encourage people to do those kinds of things. You want to talk about the date that the election could be canceled and maybe explain why that will be, the date the ballots will be mailed out. And then for issue committees, this you would only want to do if you actually had issue committees. This is the information you want to give issue committees. Again, the Fair Campaign Finance Report filing dates, the dates the ballots will be mailed out, the dates for submitting comments, only if it's for a ballot issue notice. And again, the last three are the same as before. And I think that is it. So we have a few questions, not a lot. So I'm going to ask Courtney to read the question, and then I will attempt to answer the question.
All right. So our first question, just one away. Our first question is, do you have to have a new resolution each year, or can you use the same one?
And I guess before I answer the question, I would want to know what type of resolution you're talking about. And so whoever submitted the question, if you would just...
From Barbara.
From Barbara, okay.
And while we wait for her to answer, I'm going to move on to the next question.
Okay.
Could this notice be included with water bills, or does it have to be completely independent like the Blue Book?
Is this from the same person?
This is from a different person. This is from Dincia, I believe.
Oh, okay.
This is related to mail ballot issues.
Okay. So if you're talking about the ballot issue notice, it has to be separate. It cannot be. There's a lot of information that you have to include. You have to include all the information about when the election is going to be held. You have to include the title of the item that's going to appear on the ballot. You have to include a bunch of financial information. You have to include summaries if you've received comments. You could receive comments on both sides or one or the other. All of that information has to be sent separately and cannot be included in the water bill.
So it looks like Dincia clarified and is asking the notice for the Tabor issue.
That's exactly what I talked about.
Okay.
Right.
And Cynthia is wondering if there is a good number of ballots to have in the office, such as 10% of the total number of ballots.
I have always been loath to identify a certain percentage. I think the best way to determine how many extras that you're going to need would be to go back and look at prior elections and maybe go back and look at how many ballots you had printed out or how many registered electors you have, what your vote was, and then, do something based on that. But every municipality is entirely different, and believe me, it's always better to have more extra on ballots and then run out.
Okay. If the board passes a resolution for a mail ballot, can the board change their minds and do a polling place election?
Well, the board always has the ability to do that, but what you have to, what's going to be important is going to be the deadlines. If they, decide they want to do a mail ballot election and then change their mind, I guess the way I would answer it is that they can do what they want, although I think that you would want them to have a pretty robust discussion on the pros and cons of each type of election prior to making the decision so that they won't change the decision. I will tell you that it is easier to go from a mail ballot to a polling place election than it is to go from a polling place to a mail ballot election, because the time frames for a mail ballot election happen a lot more longer before the election than for a polling place.
And Josie would like to know, if you don't have an ordinance to cancel the election, can you pass one, then cancel the election with a resolution?
Yeah, that's exactly how it works. And if you don't have an ordinance canceling the election, I would put that in place well before the day of your election. and well before any of those deadlines regarding write-in candidates, withdrawals, and canceling the election occur. So you may not be able to get it on your December meeting schedule, but I would do it as soon as you can. And actually what you've got is the ordinance. The ordinance deals with how you deal with write-in candidates, and there is a separate proposition within the ordinance that also talks about canceling the election. And if you go to state statute, it gives you instructions on how it is you are going to craft. And this would be a situation where you could go out on the listserv and ask somebody for who did this before for information on what their ordinance looked like.
Okay. Sheila is asking if the destruction date of ballots, are they the same for both polling place and mail ballot elections?
I believe they are, yes.
Okay. And it looks like Barbara has responded. She looked up her resolution, but then she's wondering if they would need to adopt a new resolution, and she's not sure how long before it would need to be adopted. Like
and this has to do with the type of the election, is that?
This was the new resolution each year. Can you use the same resolution?
Yeah, if you know that you're going to be conducting mail ballot elections, and that's really the only time you have to have a resolution, is if you're going to do and if you know you're going to be doing mail ballot elections for your regular election on a regular basis, in other words, you've made the commitment to do it, and let me just tell you that you don't want to confuse the voters. You kind of pick one, because if you have a mail ballot election, and remember, all elections conducted by the county clerk and recorders are done by mail. People are used to having mail ballot elections. In my experience and my discussions with the clerks, it's generally the elected officials who are not convinced about having mail ballot elections, but the citizens clearly are. The vote, it's easier to vote, the voter turnout is higher, but once you start down one path, it's going to be hard to go the other way. Getting back to answering the question, however, if you believe that mail ballot elections is going to be the way you're going to go from here on out, there's no reason why you can't pass a resolution that states that all regular municipal elections shall be conducted as mail ballot elections, and that way you don't have to keep doing it every year.
Okay. On the night of an election, and you are doing a mail-in election, do you need to be set up to allow people to vote, or is it just a drop-off?
You need to have the ability for people to vote a replacement ballot, but we're not required to have machines. It's not like the county where they have vote centers. What they would do in your office is they would drop off their ballot, they could request a ballot and then vote it, or they can just turn in their destroyed ballot or come in and fill out a form for a replacement ballot.
And going back to the Tabor notice, is there a statute reference for Tabor issue notice requirements?
Oh, yes. If you go to the very beginning of this presentation, we talked about going to Title I, either the Colorado Constitution or Title I that talks about the requirements for Tabor notices. So I'm just going to refer you back there. And remember, this will be online for anybody who wants to go back and refer it. Usually it takes about 48 hours, but you can always go back and look at it again.
And it looks like our last question is, do we have to have mail ballots?
No. At the municipal level, mail ballot is optional.
All right. Well, it looks like those are all of our questions.
Okay, great. So people, I think most people know how to contact me. You can contact me through the listserv. I will say that, and one thing I want everybody to be aware is that when you pose a question on a listserv, it's public. It's like any other email. It's public. And so you're likely to get answers from a lot of people, which I think is one of the great things about the listserv. Sometimes if you don't know how to get in touch with me and you just put my name down there, I will contact you directly if I believe that it's just an answer to a question that only you need to have and not everybody. So I will go ahead and make that decision. But I think most people, and I think in the election book, my contact information is also listed. Were there a couple of other questions I see come in?
There's one more, and it's
Okay.
asking if the CML election books were mailed.
Yes, they were.
They were. Deborah will need to reach out to you to get one to you. Deborah Woods.
Okay.
Okay, so Karen, thank you so much. Those are all of our questions. Everyone out there, thank you for listening today and attending this webinar. A couple of people have asked if this information will be available online in different formats, and yes, it will. It'll be up on our website no later than the end of this week. And just a friendly reminder, CMCA is offering a half a credit for these webinars. And to register, you'll need to go to the CML website and submit a cmcaclerks@gmail.com.
Okay. And just a reminder that our next webinar, elections webinar in this series is going to be December 12th. It's going to be on nomination petitions. And I want to thank everybody for coming. It was great to see you, even though I didn't see you. And hopefully we'll see you again.
All right, everyone. Thank you. Have a nice afternoon.